We are now joined by recurring guest Matt Newton, the publisher of Cavaliers Now. He was on the show last year to break down one of the matchups between Syracuse and Virginia, and he's back this year to preview the game between the Orange and the Cavaliers, this time in early December, recording this late November. Matt, how are you?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on again.
So, what is there to know about Virginia? What's different from last year to this year?
I mean, everything. Starting with the roster, the only name you're really going to see on there that you really recognize is Reese Beekman. He's the only starter that comes back from last year's team that lost four of its starting five of its top six scorers. You also get back Isaac McNeely, who was the team's leading three-point shooter last year. And then Ryan Dunn played a few minutes as well. But those are the only three guys who were key rotation players from last season. And this year's team is just totally different. They went into the transfer portal, got four guys. You'll see most of them play significant minutes, and then also a few freshmen. So you'll probably see a freshman starting at center for Virginia, which is not something that you usually see from Tony Bennett's squad. That's Blake Buchanan, a freshman from Idaho. And it's just new faces everywhere. And for a Tony Bennett program that has relied a lot on experience over the years, that's definitely unusual to see so many new guys playing big minutes for this team.
Obviously, this kind of becomes a completely different look for a team going forward. What can UVA fans really expect out of this team, especially with the last couple of years, maybe a little more stability, and now kind of getting thrown into the fire and testing Tony Bennett a little?
Yeah, definitely not exactly the most stable situation. We've seen a lot of different rotations early in the year. We had a bunch of different starting lineups, and they're still trying to figure out the front court. That's where the biggest question marks are. They know they have a bona fide star in Ryan Dunn, who is an NBA first round prospect next year at the four, but they can't figure out who to put next to him at the five. We all expected it to be Jordan Minor, a transfer from Merrimack. He hasn't played too much early on. That's why you've seen the freshman Blake Buchanan. But as with any freshman, there have been some growing pains. The other options are Jake Groves, who's a transfer from Oklahoma. He's a fifth year senior, but he's not really a center. He's 6 foot. He's 6'9", but he's on the skinnier side, and so he's better as a stretch four. So Virginia really lacks that true center who has the experience to play that position, and they've enjoyed having a really experienced rim protector in the past, and so they're missing that now. What I will say is that I think this team defensively has one of the highest ceilings of any that Tony Bennett has had at Virginia, because it might be Tony Bennett's most athletic team that he's ever had. Between Ryan Dunn, Reese Beekman, Leon Bond is a redshirt freshman who's playing really well early in the season. They have a ton of athletes who, even when there's defensive breakdowns, they're really good at recovering block shots, steals, very active hands. This UVA team gets more steals than you usually see. They're usually not the most aggressive defense. This year that's changing a little bit.
So, with the current age of college basketball, NIL, transfer portal, retaining talent is really important. And you mentioned, Virginia does not have a lot of the same players it had a last season for a variety of reasons. How is Tony Bennett adjusting to that and trying to supplement this roster with talent, whether that be high school recruiting or using the transfer portal and then through NIL collectives?
That's a question that Tony's been asked a lot this year and just over the last couple of years. And his approach has been that he wants to stay true to his principles as much as he possibly can, while recognizing that in order to remain competitive in this age of college basketball, you have to be able to adapt. So we saw him hit the transfer portal heavy this offseason, but it was because he had to. They lost, I think, seven. It ended up being seven scholarship players through either graduation, the transfer portal, or somebody leaving early for the NBA draft. And so it kind of forced his hand. I don't think he goes into any offseason thinking, I have to get four new players in the transfer portal, because that's not the way that he's done it for the last 14 years. And so he would prefer to not have to bring in so many new faces, because the way that Virginia basketball has run for the entire time he's been there is get guys who want to be here, get guys who want to be at UVA, go through that growth process and develop over time. You don't usually get a lot of players who are playing right away, freshman and sophomore year. They're patient, they stay in the program, they develop, and then they get they're peaking by their junior and senior seasons. That's a lot harder to do nowadays, to tell an 18-year-old kid, who's seeing around the country everybody get these NIL deals and immense playing time early on. That hasn't been a thing at Virginia. I will say that while a lot of it is unconfirmed, we've heard some pretty good things about what UVA has been able to offer on the basketball side from an NIL perspective. So I think they're competitive there. I don't think that's been a reason that guys aren't going. But Tony is never going to tell a recruit that he's guaranteed to play early on. And that is a big reason why they've missed out on some of their bigger 5-star targets, because that's what they want to hear. They want to hear that they're going to play right away. So you can see him adjusting a little bit. They've adjusted to NIL, they've adjusted to the transfer portal, but there are things that Tony won't budge on, his principles. And the bottom line is there's still a type of player and a type of person that Tony Bennett is going to recruit, and he's never going to budge on that. He's never going to bring in a guy that doesn't fit the culture of the program that he's built at Virginia.
That kind of specific model that you mentioned that he's built at Virginia kind of feels like it's really obviously brought success to the program, but now not really sure if that can take the program any farther. Obviously not passing the first round after that championship in 2018, 2019. Do you feel like this kind of success run of UVA has evened out and plateaued a little bit more? Or do you think there's still room to break through for some more Final Four runs or championships?
I'd say there's still room, and maybe that's just the optimist in me. But if we talk about a plateau, I think there is a plateau in the sense that the last time they won an NCAA tournament game was the championship in 2019. And if you look strictly at March Madness success, that's not great. You don't want to, for a program that's consistently a higher seed in the NCAA tournament, to not have an NCAA tournament win in 5 years, it's not good by any measure. But I don't think you can measure a program's success entirely on the NCAA tournament, because you are playing a season for the other 4 months out of the year. And at the end of the day, only one team can win the national championship at the end. There's a lot of really good programs out there that have never won one. But when you look at what they've done since winning that national championship, they've got a couple of ACC regular season titles. They've been top 4 seeds in the NCAA tournament a handful of times. They've made it to the ACC championship game. Tony Bennett is still winning a lot of games, and there's people who place a large value on that. I don't think, we should be discrediting anything that they do before they get to March, just because they seem to have some problem with that first round. They can't beat the double-digit seed that just lights them up in the first round. I think some of it with March Madness is just the luck of the draw. I think maybe UVA used up a bit of its store of luck on that run to the national title in 2019, and it's kind of maybe come back to even it out in the first round in their last couple of tries. But I think Tony Bennett is too good of a coach, and they do have too much talent for this run from the last 4 or 5 years where they can't seem to get past the first round. I don't think that'll last. I think I see them making the tournament this year again. I see them winning a game or two. And I don't know. We'll see how this team kind of puts itself together, but I don't see a plateau in the sense that they can never make it back to the Final Four. I think Tony Bennett is too good of a coach. I think they have too much talent in the program. They have too much talent coming in. I think that there's still more March success for this program to have.
How do you think the expansion of the ACC impacts that, adding Stanford, Cal, SMU? How does that, does it uniquely impact Virginia in any way? Does it help? Does it hurt? Overall, how does it change things for UVA?
It's an interesting question. And I think if you asked Tony Bennett, well, first, you probably wouldn't get a straight answer right now, because he'd say we're focused on, Texas A&M tonight and Syracuse on Saturday. So you'd have to ask him in June or something like that when he's got nothing else going on. I'm sure he's got some interesting thoughts. I appreciate that you ask it with regards to basketball, because most people consider it only with regards to football and what those programs will bring to the ACC. And I think there's some exciting things there. The number one concern everybody always had was travel, right? Especially for some of the Olympic sports, having to go out west. I think the ACC has done a fine job of managing that. I mean, even looking at what they did with the football schedules in terms of limiting teams having to go across the country, they only got to do it every other year. I imagine they'll do something similar. I think I have to reserve my full answer to this question until we see what the schedule looks like, because it was only a few years ago that the ACC shifted to the 20-game conference model for men's basketball, and I'm interested to see how that changes, because I think I like the way the conference has handled its scheduling, with you have two teams that you play twice a year, and then there's kind of a rotation of who you play twice a year in other years. And I'd like to see that stay. I'm not sure that adding three teams is going to impact it that much. But I'm interested to see how they handle scheduling, because as long as everything's handled right, then the impact should be minimal. I think it'll be fun to play these new teams. I remember Virginia had a really good couple of games with Cal back in, I think, 2015 and 2016. Jaylen Brown was there, and we had this great matchup between Malcolm Brogdon and Jaylen Brown that went to overtime, I think, when Cal was at Virginia. Now, obviously, that was a long time ago, but that's kind of the only thing I have to go off of in terms of Virginia playing SMU and Cal and Stanford. I mean, I think it just adds a fun flavor to the conference, and we'll see what those programs look like from a basketball standpoint moving forward. But it's exciting.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, UVA a lot more familiar with Syracuse than Cal, Stanford, or SMU. In the last 10 games, UVA 9-1 against Syracuse. I want to know what makes UVA so impactful against Syracuse. Obviously, no longer running the 2-3 zone and kind of mixing it up with man-to-man. But what do you think has been kind of the biggest thing to make the Cavaliers just so overpowering against SU?
So it's interesting. I'm very interested to see this matchup, because it'll be the first time Virginia's playing Syracuse without that 2-3 zone. I do think that some of it has to do with Virginia having figured out the 2-3 zone to an extent. It kind of seemed like maybe it took some trial and error early in each matchup, but Tony Bennett eventually figured out, who do I need to have in the center of that zone in order to kind of break it down. And so I think once he did that, Syracuse was in an uphill battle from there, because if Virginia is scoring at a high enough level, you're not going to beat them, because you're not going to be able to score consistently enough on the other end. It's the same way that Syracuse was able to win so many games under Jim Boeheim. They had the athletes and the talent to score enough, and the 2-3 zone, while it wasn't perfect, it caused enough problems. It got other teams out of sync enough that Syracuse could win a ton of those games, because they're like, we're going to score more than you. We're going to be able to score on your defense more than you're going to score on ours. And I think when Virginia and Syracuse got together all those years between Tony Bennett and Jim Boeheim, Bennett had the upper hand because he could rely on his system, his defensive system, a little more than Boeheim could on his 2-3 zone, because Tony had kind of figured it out a little bit. Now, that wasn't perfect every single time. There were some really close matchups. And we all, I can remember probably every single one of the losses to Syracuse in the last decade. They were pretty significant. The one in the last 10, I think that you mentioned, I was there for. It was in 2020. And I think Syracuse had scored something like 40, like maybe 40 in regulation, and then they scored 20 in overtime, because Joe Girard and Buddy Boeheim went off. I think they hit like 6 threes in overtime or something like that. But that's usually what it took, and that's why Tony was able to have so much success against Syracuse. So I'm interested to see, it'll be more of a typical ACC matchup where Syracuse has, gotten rid of the traditional 2-3 zone, and it's more of a Tony against any ACC team at that point. So I'm interested to see how kind of this basketball rivalry enters a new chapter.
I know every team says this about, teams they play often, but I do think it will be a huge reprieve for Syracuse fans to not see Kihei Clark on the other side of the floor, considering how well, he was often the guy, at least over these last few years, that Tony Bennett was putting in the middle of the zone to make those key decisions. I feel like one year he may have been close to a triple-double, or at least a double-double with points and assists, the way he was able to find shooters or the big guys down low. Over the past couple of seasons. Looking back to last year's matchups, Syracuse, or I guess Virginia by 5 over Syracuse up in the Dome, and then only won by 7 down in Charlottesville. Would you expect this to be a close game as well, based on the results we've seen from the Cavaliers over the course of the season, beating Florida by 3, beating West Virginia by 2? They've been playing a lot of close games over the course of this young season.
Yeah, I would be very surprised to see this go into the double digits in terms of end deficit. Now, Virginia did get run off the floor by Wisconsin at Fort Myers. That was a combination of a couple of things. Virginia went ice cold from the perimeter, which We're not sure how good of a 3-point shooting team this is going to be. We know that individually there are a few guys who can knock down a shot. But as with any Virginia team, if the shots from outside the arc aren't falling, it's going to be hard for them to get to 60 points. That combined with Virginia's biggest weakness right now, and I'm sure you were probably going to ask it at some point, so I apologize if I steal one of your questions. Right now is defensive rebounding. I mentioned the issues in the front court where they haven't really.
Oh, welcome to the club. Syracuse's issue too.
And so I'm definitely afraid of it tonight because Texas A&M comes in the ACC SEC Challenge as the #1 offensive rebounding team in the country. And so Virginia got bludgeoned on Virginia's defensive glass against Wisconsin. And that's how that ended up being such a lopsided result, is Wisconsin had so many second chance opportunities and Virginia just wasn't making shots on the other end. To go back to your original question, yeah, there have been 3, I think, major conference opponents Virginia has played. This will be the fourth one, but the third one in a row. And so what we've seen in those games is Virginia is good enough to win them, but I don't think Virginia is good enough right now to blow a team out who's kind of matching them in terms of talent level. And so I expect this to be a close game. I think that tonight will be a good litmus test. I apologize. I keep saying tonight. I'm sure this podcast is going to be posted today. We're talking about Wednesday night, Virginia versus Texas A&M. Got the number 14 ranked team in the country coming in. That'll be a good confidence measure to figure out, how do I feel about this team going into Saturday against Syracuse? I do expect the Syracuse game to be close.
You talked a little earlier about how it's kind of maybe a shaky feel around the program a little bit when you have a freshman center and new pieces in place for Tony Bennett. I was wondering if you've kind of noticed a theme with this team, maybe if Tony Bennett is putting it on his team, or kind of a rallying cry that the community has to kind of push this team forward. Have you seen any of that?
Well, I'll tell you that for most of the UVA community right now, they're hoping that this team puts it together right now and wins some games, because it's around this time of year every year that all UVA sports fans shift their attention entirely away from football and towards basketball. The end of the football season was not a good one for Virginia, and so they're eager to see, their big sport, kind of turn things around. So I would say from a community perspective, they're kind of just hoping that Tony does what he usually does. The week in Fort Myers, those 2 games definitely did not inspire confidence, right? They go in, they were 4-0, I think, going into that week. And it was a good field, right? It was SMU, West Virginia, and Wisconsin. Those are quality teams, but it was one that I think UVA fans and just basketball fans in general expected Virginia to win, and not easily, but not really, like it wasn't going to be impossible for them to do that. It was likely. They had just been ranked number 24, I think, going into that week. And so those 2 performances, even though they did go 1-1, they were able to avoid going 0-2. They were disappointing. First, you get blown out by a Wisconsin team that I think that most UVA fans expected Virginia to be able to beat. Virginia has had some good success against Wisconsin over the years, kind of with both teams playing a similar style where they're willing to play in the 40s and 50s in terms of final score. And then on Wednesday, you played a very shorthanded West Virginia team. I think they had 7 scholarship players available. And so to see that game come down to the wire and to see Virginia again struggle on the defensive glass, I think that has caused kind of a shaking of the confidence right now in this team. They were feeling pretty good after the win over Florida. It was a decent start to the season. They were excited about the way the new pieces were being integrated. I think anytime you get a bunch of new faces in a Tony Bennett program, people are really excited because he does, Tony Bennett can't do what he usually does, which is reward experience. He has to play inexperienced guys. He has to play the freshmen. So people are really excited to see that. And so now it'll be interesting to see. They've had a week off since that West Virginia game. They had a lot to work on. They still have to figure out the front court. They still have some things to clean up on the defensive end, but most importantly, they got to figure out how to rebound the ball. And so I think this is a key turning point where Virginia still has some pretty significant non-conference matchups coming up with Texas A&M on Wednesday night. And then they're going to Memphis later in December. And I think those games combined with this early ACC matchup against Syracuse is going to determine how a lot of people feel about what the ceiling is for this program. Because even before the season started, Tony Bennett talked a lot about how this was going to have to be the long game for this team. He knew they weren't going to be really good right away. There was just too many pieces for that. It's too difficult to learn the pack line defense. It's not going to be at its best this early in the season. But he thought the potential of the team was to be playing really good basketball by the end of the year. Well, by the end of December, we'll know kind of, I think, what the ceiling for this team is, and these matchups against A&M, Syracuse, and Memphis will do a lot to figure that out.
Everything you've been saying about Virginia is pretty much exactly how I've been, and a lot of people have been feeling about Syracuse too. Adrian Autry's talked at length that, this is a Syracuse team that its starting lineup is 4 sophomores and a junior, and the junior is a transfer. So he's in his first year at Syracuse. So it's a very inexperienced group. And a lot of those things you said ring pretty much the exact same for this Syracuse team that, we were saying, don't panic after, you go to the Maui Invitational and you lose games to big time teams. And I know it's a little different for Virginia based on its opponents in its early season tournaments, but it's interesting because you kind of think of this Virginia Syracuse game. You almost think of it as a non-conference game because of where it falls in the schedule. Syracuse plays LSU last night on Tuesday and plays really well. And then, like Virginia does with a game against Memphis coming up, Syracuse has a neutral site game against Oregon. So you have another big non-conference test. These two teams are on pretty similar paths and are going to need some time. I'm curious your thoughts on the ACC schedule. The way it kind of works is kind of fascinating to me because, from a Syracuse perspective, I looked at the schedule and I was like, oh, Syracuse only has to play Duke, North Carolina, Miami, and Virginia a combined 5 times. Those are, what was supposed to be the top 4 teams in the conference probably. How does Virginia's ACC schedule look? And, if Tony Bennett wants his team to be peaking in February and into March, does the schedule permit for that?
Yes, absolutely it does. And I haven't examined Syracuse as the way you guys have, obviously, but based on what you said, it seems like Virginia and Syracuse got dealt a similar hand in the sense that, it's a little bit fortunate you miss the big dogs of the ACC in terms of not having to play them twice. Virginia only gets Miami, Duke, and North Carolina once each. I'm pretty sure. Let me just double check that real quick.
Yeah. Syracuse gets North Carolina twice, Duke, Miami, Virginia once.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's only once each for Miami, Duke, and North Carolina, and that's fortunate. And the other part of it is that's all in kind of the back end of the schedule. So Virginia gets Miami on February 5th. So that's the only one that's like kind of at the midway point of the ACC schedule. But they don't play North Carolina until Saturday, February 24th. And then they're at Duke on March 2nd in one of the final games of the ACC calendar. So that's advantageous for a team that, like I said, has some building to do, has to build chemistry, has to figure out how to play together, has to figure out how to implement Tony Bennett's system, the way that we've seen it with some of his more experienced teams. We know that there are some growing pains that this team has to go through. And so it's very advantageous for Virginia's ACC schedule that the supposed best teams in the conference aren't in their schedule until the last 6 weeks of the season, and they only have to play them once each. So I'd say that works out pretty well for UVA.
Yeah, Syracuse the opposite. It's got Virginia on December 2nd. It's got Duke on January 2nd. Miami and North Carolina also in the month of January. It's a back loaded easier part of the schedule. One more thing before we wrap things up here, Matt. We got about 6 to 8 inches of snow here in Syracuse yesterday. How are things down in Charlottesville? Will the Syracuse players and coaches be getting a reprieve of a little warm weather? Because they just came back from Hawaii, so I was talking to them, the players in the locker room last night, like miss the warm weather.
Well, it's not warm, I'll say that. Although on Saturday it might be a little bit warm. That maybe they could actually play this one outside. I think it will be up in the high 50s at the time that Virginia and Syracuse are playing right now, or on Saturday. Right now it's in the low 30s, but that's because it's still pretty early in the morning. So if they came right now and tried to play the game, I'm sure they'd still feel like they were in Syracuse. Definitely wouldn't feel like they were in Hawaii, I'll tell you that. But yeah, so hopefully they'll have some decent weather when they're getting off the plane on Friday and Saturday.
Matt, can't thank you enough for your time. Really looking forward to Saturday's game. Where can people read your stuff?
Yeah, so my website is Cavaliers Now. If you just look up Cavaliers Now, it'll come up. It's the Sports Illustrated Virginia Cavaliers site on the Fan Nation Network. So you can just look up Sports Illustrated Virginia, or you can look up Cavaliers Now, and you'll find all my stuff, including upcoming some preview content for this game, Virginia and Syracuse.
Awesome. Thank you so much again, Matt. Really appreciate you coming on the pod. Always a pleasure, and looking forward to Saturday's game.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
We're now joined by Jerry Ratcliffe, who's been covering Virginia for over 40 years at this point, a member of the Virginia Sports Hall of Fame. Jerry, how are you doing on this Wednesday morning?
Doing great, Ethan, and Jordan, thanks for having me. It's exciting to be with you guys.
Pleasure to be with you as well. So, starting big picture with Virginia, what is kind of the state of Tony Bennett's program right now as we enter, what is this, 4 years removed from the 2019 national title?
Right. Well, last year was a little bit of a disappointment, even though they won the ACC regular season title and had some pretty decent players, but they faded a little bit down the stretch, and then it was everybody still befuddled by their postseason play, losing to Furman in the first round. And so a mass exodus of players at the end of the season, which some of it was predictable, some of it wasn't. And he had to almost rebuild from scratch. At one point last year, he only had 4 guys on his roster, including Reese Bigman, who at that point was still considering jumping to the NBA. And so they had to hit the transfer portal hard and try to piece this thing back together again. And right now it's going well. There's trying to build the chemistry and experiment with lineups, etc. But a couple of warts have been exposed, and this is going to be a big week for them, playing Texas A&M tonight here in the ACC SEC Challenge, and then hosting Syracuse on Saturday. It's going to be it'll tell us a lot about this basketball team.
You mentioned a lot of roster turnover. Top 3 scorers from last year's team gone. Reese Beekman, the fourth leading scorer, is the top scorer so far this year. How has that adjustment been for Tony Bennett, trying to kind of get used to his new roster and figuring some stuff out in the first couple of weeks of the season?
Well, I think Tony's one of these guys that just really attacks things. He's an incredible competitor, and he doesn't mind being challenged. So I think he's enjoyed the coaching part of it, trying to blend these guys together and see what he can do with them. Beekman has been a big part of everything. He's a guy that went to the NBA Combine, worked out for a lot of NBA teams, and then came back a more confident guy, more of a leader, vocally and on the floor. And he's really helped this team. In the past, he wasn't that aggressive on offense, and so that's been a big change in him. He's not afraid to take over a game. We saw that against West Virginia. We saw it against Florida. He wants the ball in his hands at crunch time, and he's been pretty good so far. And we already knew he was a menace on defense. But I think the questions to be solved is, how's this team going to rebound? They were out rebounded 48-21 in the bad loss to Wisconsin that just physically dominated them down in Fort Myers in that tournament. And then even West Virginia, who they beat in the waning seconds of that game, out rebounded them 41-28. So they've got a lot of work to do. They're not a really big team. A couple of the big guys transferred out, and so their biggest guy is a 6'11" freshman, Blake Buchanan, who they beat out Gonzaga for, and he's been a pleasant surprise and a little more physical than we thought he would be, but he needs another year in the weight room to be able to take on the bruisers in the ACC.
And when you got a 7'4" Naheem McLeod for Syracuse probably matching up with him coming up, that'll be a fascinating matchup to see how the freshman handles that. Going back to Tony Bennett, as you know, as someone who's watched a lot or most of his career coaching at Virginia, what makes him different than other coaches you'll see around the country, and how is he, a unique leader for the Virginia program?
Well, I'll tell you, Ethan, a lot of coaches preach defense, but Tony Bennett eats, sleeps, and breathes defense. I've never seen a coach that is so defensive, detail oriented. I mean, they spend the majority of their practices every day working on defense, and there's been some of his teams through the years. It's a real achievement to score 40 points on these guys, and it's a philosophy he adapted from his father, Dick Bennett, who invented the pack line defense essentially when he was the head coach at Wisconsin. And it's funny, it was a Michigan team came in here a few years ago, and one of the kids that played for Michigan was the son of a pro. I can't remember which one he was, but I think they scored like 36 points against Virginia. And when he came to the press room, and he said, "Damn, is that all these guys do is practice defense?" I mean, they were clearly frustrated. They want to frustrate you. And Tony Bennett is a very intense. Most people see him as a really nice guy, laid back, but he's a fierce competitor. He hates losing at anything, and he can get really intense, particularly in practice if his team's not doing right. Down at the ACC tip-off in Charlotte a few weeks ago, I was talking to him, and he said I asked him how the team was practicing, and he said, "Well, they had a great practice yesterday." He said, "I didn't, because I exploded on them because they weren't doing things the way I wanted them to do." And it was a real awakening for some of the new players who had never seen that side of Tony Bennett before. But he's just a fierce competitor, and you would think sometimes that he's ready to go out onto the court and play. He's so fired up during games. And I actually sat beside of him at a game at VCU a few years ago, and we normally don't get that close up a look at him, but I was actually sitting right beside of him, at the end of the press table, right beside his seat. And I saw a side of Tony Bennett you can't tell from the press area in normal games. And I remember one mad scramble for a loose ball that came out of bounds right in front of us, and the referee called the VCU ball, and I thought he made a bad call, and Tony really thought he made a bad call, and Tony was just just going in a million different directions. And he turned to me and he said, "Was that a good call?" And I said, "No." And he said, "I thought so." But he just gets so intense in games, it's unbelievable. But he's a fierce competitor, and he'll do anything within the legalities to win a basketball game.
Yeah, that's awesome. The game that I remember, Syracuse, Virginia, when Virginia in the opener in 2019 beat them, Syracuse 48-34.
Yes,
Elite score right there. We're talking about the defense and Tony Bennett's coaching, something that's been a staple for Syracuse. Obviously, Jim Boeheim and the 2-3 zone no longer necessarily with the program consistently. Adrian Autry, the new head coach, running a lot of man-to-man. How much does that major adjustment in the coaching style and the defensive style for Syracuse impact Virginia's prep and game plan going into Saturday's game?
Well, I know that I think Tony actually had a good solution for the 2-3 zone, probably more so than anybody else that I've seen. He seemed to know how to attack it. He apparently put a formula together several years ago where he would sometimes use a point guard in the high post and distribute the balls on the wings But he had great success for the most part against the 2-3 zone. So I think Tony's probably would like to see that come back, but certainly he's a adept at the man-to-man, which we see most of the time, and what they play to some degree. But I think it'll be interesting. It'll be strange to see Syracuse not sitting back in that zone after all these years.
It's been an adjustment for us too. Having to watch having to watch man to man, and it's very different having Adrian Autry on the sidelines and not Jim Boeheim. How close were Boeheim and Tony Bennett? Because Virginia has kind of had Syracuse's number of late, won 9 of the last 10 matchups. So obviously have the 2016 Elite Eight game where Syracuse stages that ferocious comeback and advances to the Final Four. What was the relationship like between Boeheim and Bennett? He was close with, I would say probably closer with other ACC coaches like Coach K and Roy Williams and Jim Larrañaga. What was that relationship like?
I think they had a really good relationship. I know Tony had great respect for Boeheim, and I think it was mutual. I miss Jim Boeheim because I always thought he was a great interview even when he got testy sometimes. But I thought he was very honest. Sometimes he didn't pull any punches. So, but I always enjoyed listening to his post games, and I had a couple of one-on-one interviews with him over the years, and he was always really good. But I think both of those guys had a lot of respect for one another and what they've been able to accomplish. Sorry, I have a dog that's going bananas. Stop. But he's out of control. He's almost as big as I am, so I can't stop him.
What kind of dog is it? What kind of dog is it?
The English pointer and a part hound. I don't know.
Wow.
He's a rescue dog I got from New York, believe it or not. But,
very cool.
Yeah. But yeah, I think those guys really enjoyed coaching against each other because they presented something different that would challenge them, and they had some really knockdown, drag out games and that elevated some team to greatness and wrecked some teams, like Syracuse did to Virginia in 2016 when all the writers were booking their plane tickets to Houston for the Final Four and watched Syracuse throw a full court press on that, and Virginia melted into a puddle of goo right before our very eyes.
Yeah, definitely. I'm looking at that this season specifically. You talked about the rebounding being a big note of concern, especially against Wisconsin. Looking at the schedule as a whole and going into the Texas A&M game, what are you looking for Virginia to improve on the most, maybe outside of the rebounding aspect?
I think they brought in a bunch of guys from the portal who had really good shooting reputations. Jake Groves from Oklahoma was a pretty dangerous 3-point shooter, and he had some pretty good moments at Oklahoma his senior year. He played with his brother, who's now in the NBA, but I think he's been okay. Andrew Rohde, who played at St. Thomas, which was a Division III school, was one of the top 3-point shooters in the country, and I think he led the freshmen in the country in scoring. And he has struggled a little bit, and that's been a surprise. And then another kid, Dante Harris, a point guard from Georgetown, who was here last February and practiced with the team as he sat out the year as a redshirt, has been a really good defensive player to kind of take up where Kihei Clark left off. A really good on-ball defender, but his offense hasn't been quite as good as everybody expected. So those three guys are probably going to have to step it up a little bit. They're really just not producing as many points as I think Tony expected, because he knew there's a lot of versatility and a lot of depth on this team, but the scoring just hasn't been there. Ryan Dunn, who has drawn some comparisons to DeAndre Hunter, is starting to live up to those reputations, and he's a three-level scorer. He can defend multiple positions. He's their leading rebounder at only 6'7", 6'8", and he's been pretty solid so far. And another kid that redshirted last year, Leon Bond, is starting to grow into his role. I think he's going to be pretty good. He's sort of a version of Dunn, really, and we haven't seen the best of him yet. He's got a big wingspan, can rebound, can defend multiple positions. But I think that the portion of the team that for them to be what they want to be, that they're going to have to step up the scoring. And Isaac McNeely is part of that. He's a really good 3-point shooter, sophomore, who started most of the games last year. And I'm a little surprised that they haven't done for him what Krzyzewski did for J.J. Redick down at Duke when they had a sharpshooter like that, and create all kinds of different screens to get him open and get him more shots. McNeely, he only took 4 shots in a couple of games, and that's not enough for him. He needs to take probably 10, 12, 15 shots a game.
You mentioned expectations. When you look at this team as a whole, is this a team that could or should be a second weekend NCAA tournament team? I know they're finished in the top 4, which would be a double bye in the ACC tournament. What should the expectations be for this team from a realistic perspective, maybe not a fan's perspective, because they just watched them win a national title 4 or 5 years, almost 5 years ago. At this point, that may not be as realistic as something else.
Right. You're exactly right. And I think that spoiled their fans to some degree, because now they expect them to go out and win the ACC every year. But I mean, it depends on how this team comes together. It looks like there's enough talent there to maybe get them to the second weekend if they get a good matchup and don't do anything silly like they did last year, and just let a team that shouldn't have been able to stay with them make it a close game, and then you're asking for trouble. But I think everybody's cautiously optimistic, because these guys have come from good stock. They've had good numbers at the other places they've been. I think it's just a matter of whether they can find the chemistry, and again, I think the rebounding, that's a puzzle they're going to have to solve, because there's going to be some teams in the ACC like Syracuse and against A&M tonight, who has some big physical guys that they're going to struggle against if they can't find ways to get boards. I know he's talking to the guards and trying to get them more involved. And Virginia's guards usually are fairly involved in rebounding. And it's hard for them to get many offensive rebounds because of the pack line, because his philosophy is to, after the shot, get back down the floor and get set up. But they've got to solve that issue if they want to make any kind of a run into the postseason, I think.
We're feeling the same things here in Syracuse. Cautious optimism, but this Syracuse and Virginia similar in that still needing a little bit more time to gel and get going. What do you think is going to? I don't want to ask you for a prediction, but the last few matchups between these two teams have been pretty close. Would you expect another close game on Saturday?
I would. I really do. And I watched a little bit of your game last night. I thought you were going to blow LSU out of the arena. But yeah, I think it'll be another close game, because the way Virginia plays, their style of play, unless they are hitting at a really high number, teams stick around, whether they're playing well or not. And Syracuse is playing well, so I expect them to make it a close game, if not win. They've won here before. I know you have a local kid on your team, Justin Taylor, who looks like he's having a decent year. But yeah, I think this will probably come down to the last 3-4 minutes, like most ACC games do, and at least against Virginia, even here at home. But it'll be interesting. If it's not a close game, I'll be really surprised.
Yeah, Justin Taylor talked about it after the game. He's excited to go back and play at Virginia again for the second straight year. Jerry, really appreciate your time. Where can we find your coverage of Virginia basketball?
Well, it's real easy. It's jerryratcliffe.com. It was going off my brand that I built here over a few decades, and so most Virginia fans are familiar with my work, but that's where you'll find it. And we do podcasts and have some internet TV shows and all sorts of stuff, so it's easy to find.
Well, really, really appreciate you taking some time with us this morning, and looking forward to reading and following along before and during Saturday's game.
Well, thank you guys for having me. I always enjoy talking to young journalists and journalism students, and I have to say I admire your background with the PGA stuff there. I'm a big golfer, and I've got a room downstairs with about 20 of those flags hanging up in there.
We can save the golf for another show, but I appreciate that.
Right. Yeah, that's right. All right, have a great day, guys.
Thank you, Jerry.